Welcome to the Hidden History of Business. I'm Frank Hutchison.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And Meredith is off again today. Today we're going to talk about fermentation. We've been talking about beer and wine and all the different types of alcoholic drinks, which are all formed by fermentation. But today we decided to broaden our approach a little bit and talk about fermentation just as a process.
Fermentation, simply put, is transforming organic substances chemically into simpler compounds. Catalyst of the action is enzymes. These are produced by microorganisms like molds or yeasts or bacteria. But in every single one of the fermentation processes, there will be some kind of catalyst that starts the process going.
And keeps it going until the food source is used up.
There are tons of advantages to fermented foods. Just a few of those are fermentation can make food more digestible. For example, soy becomes much more digestible after it's been fermented. It can also create an improved flavor or texture. It can synthesize vitamins. We talked in another podcast about how beer is very high in B vitamins, so it can actually make food more nutritious. It can destroy or mask some undesirable flavors. It can reduce the carbohydrates of a food. It can decrease required cooking time, and importantly, it can increase the storage life of a food to ferment it.
It can also sometimes take what would be waste and turn it into something useful.
And another thing that fermented foods can do, they can replenish your intestinal microflora. That's why sometimes after you've been on an antibiotic, your doctor will tell you to eat some yogurt to replenish the bacteria colonies in your gut.
That's right, which are very necessary.
Yes, they are.
So we have these fermentations which are activated either by molds, yeast, or bacteria. And sometimes it's a combination, sometimes it's singular. But what they do is they start working on the complex carbohydrates and breaking them down into simpler compounds, usually sugars or an alcohol.
Now we think of alcohol as the major end product of fermentation, the beer, the wine, the spirits that we've been talking about. But fermentation covers a huge spectrum of foods that you may not even think of as fermented. And across just about every single culture, over thousands of years that has been on this earth, just about every single culture has some kind of fermented food. And alcohol, of course, being a primary one. But cheeses and yogurts, as I mentioned before, those are fermented. Bread can be fermented, especially like a sourdough bread.
Well, and the bread has to be fermented unless it's a flat bread type thing, because that's what makes it light, and so it isn't a heavy type loaf. Then, in fact, one of the things that the fermentation does is it not only breaks down the complex carbohydrates into sugars and alcohol, but it also creates carbon dioxide, which causes the little bubbles in bread.
Absolutely. An example of that is that wonderful Ethiopian bread, the injera. That spongy little flatbread, perfect example of that. You got all the little holes in there because that's where the carbon dioxide was.
That's right.
Other foods that may be familiar to some of our listeners, fish sauce and soy sauce, very common in Asian cuisine.
And in fact, the interesting thing is that probably fermentation for beer and, of course, for bread, widespread. But in Asia, they were probably the first to recognize it as a life process, that it was not just something magical that was happening, but that there was actually something that was causing it to happen, and that was something that was alive. In fact, they looked at two molds that they called white robe and yellow robe. And the thing about molds is that you can see them. Now, normally here in the West, we look at something that's moldy and say, yuck, we don't want that. But because they could see it and they knew that these molds would basically cause the fermentation, they would actually cultivate the mold. And they would have it so that they could have like starter kits to put the mold into whatever they wanted to ferment so that they could have the resulting product that they were looking for.
Other dairy products that are fermented, sour cream or kefir, which was very common in the northern Caucasus Mountains, kimchi in Korea, or sauerkraut in Germany.
Yes.
Again, all over the world, we have these fermented foods. Miso is fermented.
And
Pickles
that goes back
are fermented.
to thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. So yeah, pickles, poi, the Polynesian food. We lived in Hawaii when I was younger, and poi is fermented.
Yes. So you have a lot of foods which are fermented. But what's also interesting is the way that we think about these foods. For example, in East Asia, if you think about mold, the people kind of have a positive attitude towards mold because mold is what generates the food that they eat. However, you offer someone in the Western culture something that's moldy, and we immediately think something like moldy bread. I don't want to eat moldy bread. That tastes terrible. On the other hand, if we think about yeast, here in the West, we think that that's something that's good because you use it to make bread or
make
beer or what have you. The way we think about yeast is the way that the Asians think about mold.
Interesting.
It is.
A couple others that you may know of. Tabasco sauce is fermented. The Tabasco or the peppers are crushed and put in a barrel to sit for 3 years. Before the seeds and whatnot are strained out, they add some vinegar to the mix and some salt and package it up and bottle it up and send it out. So Tabasco sauce is fermented.
I think they do that longer than they do whiskey. So.
3 years is a long time. Worcestershire sauce is also fermented. I mean, fermentation is a huge part of our diet, whether we are aware of it or not. Vinegar, which is kind of a step beyond wine, has been fermented and then processed further to get to it. We use fermented foods all the time, whether we realize it or not.
This is The Hidden History of Business. This is Frank Hutchison.
And this is Emily Geddes.
We hope to see you again.
If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.